Jarad McHugh here, and this is Becoming Human, where we look at art as a tool for self-discovery. And in this episode, I'm going to be looking at some of the intersections of art and spiritual practice. I mean, something that really stood out to me when I was first getting into art, probably around high school, something like that, college. I was reading these pieces by, poets and writers I admired, or looking at paintings and things like that, or even reading comic books. And it kept occurring to me that all of these artists that I was attracted to seemed to be pointing to something. They seemed to be pointing to some sort of deeper aspect of life that I felt I wasn't in full contact with. So in that way, art became this kind of vehicle for, again, something deeper that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I ended up going to grad school and reading way more than I probably ever will again, and I kept coming across that same thing, these artists who kept pointing to something that was just over the hill, something right over there, something just out of reach, something beyond thought, that was still nonetheless able to be conveyed in various mediums. Again, everything from writing to music to comic books and movies and so on. So I kept pushing and learning and pushing to figure out what that thing that I wasn't quite seeing was. And that actually ended up leading me to Zen Buddhist practice, which I felt was enacting and practicing everything that I was picking up on in my art practices. It was kind of mainlining what I thought I was getting at through art. And that doesn't mean that I then jumped ship on art and just really stuck to spiritual practice and, that's it, that's the answer now. Absolutely not. If anything, that overlap and that connection just keeps deepening more and more. So in this episode, I want to share with you a chapter from, well, actually, it's a book that's unreleased yet. It's going to be released probably this September, but Deepening Zen, the Long Maturation, Book 2, authored by Mitra-roshi Bishop, and I'm currently editing that book. So we've been working on it together, going back and forth, spending hours each day just editing and rewriting and developing more content and tweaking all the, small punctuation and words to make sure that it says exactly what it needs to say. And it's been a cool process. It's been a really interesting process. And my favorite chapter that we've worked on so far is chapter 12. It's going to be called Nirvana. And the reason that this chapter is so interesting to me is because we actually included a bit of John Keats's poetry. And John Keats, if you don't know, he was a British romantic poet, born in 1795, died very young at the age of 25 in 1821. Was supposed to turn 26 that year, but died early in the year. And he died of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis ravaged pretty much everyone in his family. And in his short life, he accomplished quite a lot. He was studying as a medical doctor for a long time, but actually abandoned that to put everything into his poetry, which he did, and it shows. And something that's uncanny with John Keats is that in his art, again, he seems to be pointing to something just over the hill, and in the excerpt that we use from The Fall of Hyperion, his unfinished epic poem, he points directly to it and says, this is what the thing is. And that thing is Nirvana. In the Buddhist realm, they would call it Nirvana. Keats doesn't call it Nirvana, but he says, this is what it is. So I'm gonna narrate this chapter. I'm gonna read chapter 12, Nirvana, from Deepening Zen. And I'm going to be stopping a little bit throughout the way to share some thoughts on John Keats, about the intersection of art and spirituality. And beyond that, I'm also going to share some of Plato's Symposium, where Socrates reflects a bit on his teacher and his philosophical lineage in which he was practicing. So that's kind of part 2 of this podcast. All right, so I'll get started. This is chapter 12 from Deepening Zen, the Long Maturation, Book 2. And this chapter is called Nirvana. Mark Epstein has been a practicing psychiatrist as well as a Theravadan Buddhist practitioner for many decades. He has written a number of excellent books expressing his insights into meditation practice informed by his understanding of psychiatry. One of those books in particular, Going on Being, Life at the Crossroads of Buddhism and Psychotherapy, is especially relevant in this chapter. His background and experience make him a perfect person to speak of these. Although in the traditional Japanese Zen way of teaching, because of the nature of Japanese culture to this day, psychotherapy has not played a role. But American culture is quite different, and in my experience, there's a wide area of overlap between therapy and Zen practice. While therapy can help a person work out their dysfunctional behaviors with the aim of achieving a certain level of ease in their life, utilizing both Zen and therapy can take a person far deeper, all the way to true liberation. And just to pause for a moment, true liberation, Nirvana, they mean the same thing, and it's that true liberation that, as you'll see, John Keats points to, and so many other artists and poets throughout, the past few hundred years at least, and actually deeper than that. I mean, if you look at a lot of ancient art and ancient poetry, you can see that those figures are pointing to that same kind of liberation or nirvana across cultures. In the context of psychotherapy, we can learn to more effectively navigate the strictures caused by our investment in a self-image, while Zen practice goes beyond that to help us see through and dissolve our attachment to a self-image, rendering us totally free of its control over our lives. And actually, I'm going to pause there again, just to define self-image, because since this is chapter 12, some of the wording, it's already been explained in the earlier chapters, so just to get you up to speed. Self-image refers to your personality structure, your psychological and social conditioning, your thoughts and thought patterns, everything you think you are, but that you're actually not. So the idea in not just Zen practice and art and spirituality and all these different traditions and practices is that there's this image of who you think you are. I'm someone who's sad. I'm someone who's happy. I'm someone who's really charismatic. I'm someone who's depressed. I'm someone who's really helpless. I'm someone who has it all together. Right? All of that. Those are just ideas. They're just narratives. They're not real. Right? I mean, it's like an actor taking on a role. Like that's all of life, right? To quote Shakespeare, all the world is a stage, and everyone players on that stage. I mean, that's true. He's not referring to just the theatrical stage. He's referring to life itself and all the masks that we wear. It's false. It's not real. So through these spiritual practices, not just Zen, but art practices and lots of other religious traditions as well, the goal is to actually begin to shed that self-image, to become who you truly are, to step into your authentic self. And I'll leave it at that. It gets pretty dense if you start to think about it too much, and you don't really want to think about it too much. You just want to start to release it. At any rate, to continue the chapter, yet Zen practice without therapy can be too narrow for many people. Historically, when people have done Zen practice and not done therapy to address their psychological issues, things did not always turn out well. There are unfortunate examples of this in the cases of Buddhist so-called teachers who sexually abused their students. When Mitra-roshi was asked how this could possibly happen by someone who is authorized to teach Zen, his response was they didn't spend a long enough time in the monastery. Traditional Zen practice has been likened to diving into a deep pool and going straight to the bottom, focused on achieving awakening and bypassing the psychological debris we have accumulated and may still be accumulating in our lives. In contrast, the Long Maturation, which can begin even before you sit on the cushion for the first time and it is a vital part of practice, can naturally involve psychotherapy. And one more side note there, the Long Maturation refers to just practicing throughout your entire life, just continuing to grow even after an awakening experience. Committing to the process of the Long Maturation, along with our deepening Zen practice, may slow our dive to the bottom of that pool as we clean out the psychological debris along the way, but will result in a far more broad and deep awakening. The difference is that with the combination of therapy and Zen, we learn to navigate our lives and conditioning with more skill and therefore more ease as we go much farther than that to become increasingly free of psychological Velcro. As you know, Velcro is a two-part material for attaching things. There's the fuzzy side and the side with tiny hooks, and when you put the two parts together, they stick to each other. To continue the metaphor, we are upholstered in either the fuzzy part or the hooked part. For example, you're in an office setting and there are some of your coworkers and higher-ups whom you feel a harmonious connection with. Metaphorically, if you're upholstered in the fuzzy side, Coming into contact with people or things also upholstered in the fuzzy side, there will be nothing to get hooked by. But that irritating person in the office, they're upholstered in the hook side. Otherwise, you wouldn't be so irritated by them. It doesn't matter which type of Velcro we're upholstered in. It's coming in contact with the opposite side that will catch us. Going to therapy can help us learn how to navigate our Velcro so we can more skillfully manage difficult situations, whereas Zen practice offers the possibility of gradually removing our Velcro so that no matter what Velcro we come in contact with, it won't catch us. We will be clear and free of that conditioning so that we will be able to work with difficult situations with perfect ease since we won't be attached to a specific outcome. And just another side note, this is true. In my experience, this is true. We do have just things that really irk us, right? And then we believe that those things are inherently bad. So, for example, one of my things is, I often feel like people who are micromanaging, that drives me absolutely insane in work situations, in life, relationships, all of that. People who I feel are trying to control me. I realized eventually, to someone else, that individual might seem really helpful. That individual might seem really caring and concerned and considerate, but to me, it seems controlling and awful, right? So then that realization clued me into, this person isn't inherently what I think they are, which means that my experience of them says more about me than it does about them. So can I do something in order to tweak my perspective, to shift my experience? And that's what this Velcro is referring to. Rather than just constantly trying to find other people that you vibe with, can you just remove that Velcro from yourself and just flow through all situations? And so far in my art and Zen practices, I think that's actually true. Okay, to continue. That said, what is this freedom? In his book, Epstein writes, Nirvana is a Buddha's word for freedom, not for death. People commonly assume that nirvana means death or even the good death. But in reality, it means the end of suffering as a result of no longer being caught in attachments. In other words, total liberation. The fear of what we assume death means is what is behind a lot of anxiety in Zen practice. The anxiety is also fueled by the assumption that we will no longer exist if we go too far into our practice. In one sense, who we think we are will little by little disappear, and who we really are, which is not a self-image resulting from conditioning, will be seen through as the false image it actually is. But before that, there's a struggle with yearning for that freedom and being terrified of it. In his poem, The Fall of Hyperion, John Keats, who was battling tuberculosis at the time, describes the tension in this moment between fear and potential freedom. He writes of a vision in which he is presented with a set of heavenly stairs and confronted with a great fear of death. The metaphor in Zen practice for those stairs is the edge of the cliff. A spirit compels him to either climb the stairs or simply die unfreed where he was, at the bottom of the steps. If thou canst not ascend these steps, die on that marble where thou art. Thy flesh, near cousin to the common dust, will parch for lack of nutriment, thy bones will wither in few years, and vanish so that not the quickest eye could find a grain of what thou now art on that pavement cold. The sands of thy short life are spent this hour, and no hand in the universe can turn thy hourglass. In response, Keats finds himself caught between the terror and yearning for liberation. I felt the tyranny of that fierce threat and hard task proposed. Prodigious seemed the toil. The leaves were yet burning when suddenly a palsied chill struck from the paved level up my limbs and was ascending quick to put cold grasp upon those streams that pulse beside the throat. I shrieked, and the sharp anguish of my shriek stung my own ears. I strove hard to escape the numbness, strove to gain the lowest step. Slow, heavy, deadly was my pace. The cold grew stifling, suffocating at the heart, and when I clasped my hands I felt them not. 1 minute before death my iced foot touched the lowest stair, and as it touched, life seemed to pour in at the toes. I mounted up. In these powerful lines, Keats chooses, not without inner conflict and immense difficulty, to step into the challenge, to step into his fear. It is by walking into this fear that he then opens to life. As was said in a previous chapter, a fear of death is a fear of life, and to drop that fear is to truly live. The Spirit then explains Keats's experience to him. Thou hast felt what 'tis to die and live again before thy fated hour. That thou hast power to do so is thy own safety. Thou hast dated on thy doom. High prophetess, said I, purge off benign if so it please thee, my mind's film. None can usurp this height, returned that shade. The Spirit assures Keats that he has walked through his fear of death and purged his mind's film or self-image, and that no one can take away his freedom. Keats died of tuberculosis before completing this poem. It was published posthumously in 1856. And I'm just going to add another comment there. I mean, it's absolutely profound. I mean, when I came across this poem, I mean, I'd read it in the past, but I read it recently and I went, holy shit, he's talking about Zen practice. He's talking about awakening, or in Japanese Zen, a kensho experience, or satori, which is awakening. It's opening to that fear of death, kind of digesting it and purging it, and then living fully through that. And that's what's so interesting. I mean, we are all terrified to die. Refer to the episode, I think it was like the second or third episode, Emptiness, Death, and Art, which talks about I think it was 1973 book, The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, where Becker talks about that deep, deep fear of emptiness and fear of death, and the way that we kind of circumscribe ourselves in these just like narrow experiences of life, right? It's like I have my car, I have my apartment, I have the people I'm okay with, and you know, if I enter any experience beyond that, I'm immediately anxious, I'm immediately scared, right? Because I need to be in control, because it's me against the world. It's separation of ego, it's self and other, right? Whereas what Keats is talking about is he died. Before he died, he had the experience of death before he died. I mean, you hear about people who have near-death experiences who come back free, fearless. They've seen the other side, and because they've seen the other side, they've seen that, well, death is actually quite okay. That it's not this big, terrifying thing. Maybe the pain leading up to it could be terrifying, but death itself is actually quite okay. And that's what Keats saw, and that's what all these old Zen masters saw. All right, to continue the chapter. As Shido Bunan, Zen grandfather of the great Zen master Hakuin, said, if you die before you die, you won't die when you die. As you get closer and closer to coming to an insight, or even a kensho, which again, kensho is a Japanese word from Japanese Zen, meaning awakening, then fear naturally can arise. It really is a fear of disappearing, a fear of death, and it is important to make friends with that, to embrace it with open arms. Feel the bodily sensations that express that fear. This can require repeated efforts, as initially we will still fear those sensations, but continue to sense more deeply into them, and eventually they will dissipate. We can plateau in the middle of this process and not reach that state of mind where fear and anxiety no longer has any hold on us. To keep that from happening as we go into the bodily sensations, the sense of energy that expresses that anxiety or fear, it's important to explore the sensations, not just sit there with them. Rather, utilize an openness to possibility, a not knowing for sure what it actually feels like or what it is actually like, and discerning the ever more subtle sensations. And another side note, this is all done during Zazen, which is Zen meditation. Look it up, read this book when it comes out, or read the first book, Deepening Zen, the Long Maturation, which gets more deeply into the actual process of Zazen and meditation and how to work with fear. This is important because eventually we won't have a choice. Ultimately, everything will be taken away. We can't take anything with us, despite what many cultures have assumed. Items expected to be needed or beneficial to the deceased in the next life are often buried in tombs and graves with bodies or burnt with them in cremation ovens. There's a vast buried army of life-size statues of horses and warriors in Xi'an, China. It was believed that the important person buried in this tomb will be continuing on to a next corporeal life, in which he would benefit from having that army at his disposal. In present-day Chinese culture, when a person is cremated, various paper representations of automobiles, houses, money, and other possessions are included in that cremation. I really hope we don't need money in the next life. That would suck. Contemporary major religions teach that the person we think we are will continue on into heaven, hell, or purgatory, depending on how much they have sinned. Some people are so terrified by the fear of becoming no more that they go to great expense to have their bodies cryogenically frozen and therefore preserved, in the assumption that they will slip back into that same body and continue life as before. These assumptions are driven by a need to posit a continuing life after death. But what is death really? There is that great fear of dying, and that is endemic in people because we don't know what it will be like. It's a fear of change, of the unknown. The hope in burying presumably needed objects for the next life after we die is an attempt to convince ourselves that there's a concrete future. Buddhism teaches that life is eternal, that what we call death and what we call birth are nothing but the emergence and the return to the sea of potentiality, the sea of eternal life from which we come forth into corporeal form and dissolve back into with our corporeal death. Socrates was said to be surrounded by his weeping students as the poison that he was condemned to drink began working its way up to his heart. He said to them, quote, "To fear death, gentlemen, is nothing other than to think oneself wise when one is not. For it is to think one knows what one does not know. No man knows whether death may not even turn out to be the greatest of blessings for a human being. And yet people fear it as if they knew for certain that it is the greatest of evils." End quote. What is death but change? Dukkha, which is a characteristic of unawakened life, is the fear of ceaseless change. Most people in the West, with the positive exception of many Native American peoples, are uncomfortable with or even terrified of change. Yet change is the only certainty in life. This fear of change underlies our fear of coming to awakening, of the experience that is nirvana. All right, so the chapter ends there. What fascinates me the most here is that overlap between what these artists like John Keats are intuitively getting into. Or Alejandro Jodorowsky from the last episode. I mean, he did have Zen training, but even before that, he was intuitively getting into something via his art, trying to get to the other side of this fear, the other side of death, the other side of life, knowing that there's something there. There's some sort of wisdom and some healthier way of being and existing. And what I really want to point out here too is that, when we do engage with the art of these incredible creators, it's instructional, right? These aren't just, they aren't just fictional ideas. In this sense, there really is no such thing as fiction. I mean, you could read Fall of Hyperion by John Keats, and you could read it in a way where you're, wow, really cool ideas, really fascinating ideas. But Keats wasn't actually just coming up with ideas. He was just narrating his actual experience. And that's what I love so much about poets, when I realized that poets aren't just describing what they're seeing in their head. They're narrating their actual experience, what's happening around them. Their visceral and sensorial experience of the world. That's what a poem is, which makes it real, even if it's totally surrealistic and bizarre and backwards and strange. There's no such thing as fiction. When you start to realize that all of it's real, there is no fiction. I mean, even something like, science fiction, you can look into that and find deep, deep wisdom, which makes it real. It's no longer fiction anymore. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears and look at, speaking of Plato, or speaking of Socrates, Plato's Symposium, which, of course, Plato always writes in the voice of Socrates. So who knows if Socrates actually said any of this, right? Or he probably did, but it's filtered through Plato. At any rate, I came across this really wonderful book. It's called The Enlightened Mind, an anthology of sacred prose, edited by Stephen Mitchell, where he goes through and just looks at all of these different traditions and periods of time where all these figures, philosophers, spiritual teachers, from Socrates to Jesus Christ to Buddha to Hermes Trismegistus, all of these different figures were, again, pointing to the same thing. So this guy, Stephen Mitchell, put this book together to say, what is it? What are they really getting at, right? So in it, he has this excerpt from the Symposium where Socrates refers to his teacher, which when I read this, it blew my mind. I didn't realize that Socrates had a teacher. Like, duh, of course. But I think the way that's taught, typically in our college systems is that Socrates just fucking like grew out of the ground, that he didn't have parents, that he didn't have like a lineage that he was coming from. He didn't have a practice, that he was just this like magic genius who just knew everything, and was just kind of floating a couple of inches off the ground as he, enlightened the people of Greece, and then they fucking killed him. Refer back to the cave episode. Apparently that's something that happens a lot, at least according to Plato, that the teacher gets killed, gets ousted, all of that, which does happen historically. I mean, I think when people threaten the system as it is enough, the system rejects them in whatever way it needs to. At any rate, in Stephen Mitchell's short introduction to this excerpt, he writes, "The first of the following selections is from Socrates' famous culminating speech in the Symposium. Most of the speech is a long quotation from his teacher, Diotima. He prefaces it by saying, quote, 'I want to talk about some lessons I was once given by a Manichaean woman named Diotima, a woman deeply versed in this and in many other fields of knowledge. She is the one who brought about a 10 years postponement of the great plague of Athens on the occasion of a certain sacrifice, and she is the one who taught me the philosophy of love.'" End quote. So it's a great little introduction, and again, I just find it so profound that, Socrates had a teacher, that he was coming from this lineage, and what's more is that he had a female teacher, which I find interesting. I mean, that seems to, at least in the philosophy classes I've taken, that seems to get left out. And I think that that's actually a narrative that would contradict our traditionally, patriarchal way of viewing things. And by patriarchal, I just mean, hyper-focus on men. I'm sure that most philosophy professors who've read Plato to any length would realize that Socrates was coming out of a tradition, was taught by a woman, but, that's something you just kind of overlook. Like, well, it's not Socrates, so who cares? But that matters hugely. I mean, lineage matters a lot. There's a reason that in Buddhism, whether it's Tibetan, whether it's Zen, I mean, people can trace back the lineages of their teachers for thousands of years. There's a reason for that. Okay, so here is the Symposium, and this is Plato quoting Socrates quoting Diotima. "Whoever has been initiated so far in the mysteries of love, capital L, love," and by the way, mysteries refers to the mystery traditions, so the Eleusinian mysteries, things like that, where people were actually meeting up in groups and engaging in spiritual practices. They weren't just sitting around doing armchair philosophy and not practicing. They were doing spiritual practices in order to make actual change in their brains, in their minds, in their spirit. So whoever has been initiated so far in the mysteries of capital L, love, and has viewed all these aspects of the beautiful in due succession, is at last drawing near the final revelation. Or, I might add, Kensho, awakening, seeing through death, like Keats did. And now, Socrates, there bursts upon him that wondrous vision, which is the very soul of the beauty he has toiled so long for. See, again, it's a practice. It's not something that Socrates just fucking grew out of the ground and knew all this stuff. "It is an everlasting loveliness which neither comes nor goes, which neither flowers nor fades. For such beauty is the same on every hand, the same then as now, here as there, this way as that way, the same to every worshipper as it is to every other." And again, this is Buddhism. This is This is the unchanging capital R reality that you're stepping into through meditation practice. And that's the goal. And again, that quality of unchanging, pristine awareness, as a lot of teachers throughout the ages have referred to it as. Nor will his vision of the beautiful take the form of a face, or of hands, or of anything that is of the flesh. It will be neither words nor knowledge, nor something that exists in something else, such as a living creature, or the earth, or the heavens, or anything that is, but subsisting of itself and by itself in an eternal oneness, while every lovely thing partakes of it in such sort that however much the parts may wax and wane, it will be neither more nor less, but still the same inviolable whole. And so, when his prescribed devotion to boyish beauties has carried our candidate so far that the universal beauty dawns upon his inward sight, he is almost within reach of the final revelation. And this is the only way he must approach or be led toward the sanctuary of capital L love. Starting from individual beauties, the quest for the universal beauty must find him ever mounting the heavenly ladder, stepping from rung to rung, exactly like Keats's poem, right? Ascending the stairs, walking through your fear of death. Ever mounting, actually, and that was exactly Keats's quote. Keats says, "The lowest stair as it touched, life seemed to pour in at the toes. I mounted up." So again, back to Diotima. Starting from individual beauties, the quest for the universal beauty must find him ever mounting the heavenly ladder, stepping from rung to rung, that is, from 1 to 2, and from 2 to every lovely body, from bodily beauty to the beauty of institutions, from institutions to learning, and from learning in general to the special lore that pertains to nothing but the beautiful itself, until at last he comes to know what beauty is. So in other words, there's all of these different forms that are the vehicle for us toward beauty and love. Maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a life spent, learning, maybe it's art, maybe it's physical beauty, all of these different things, just attraction that pulls us toward beauty, or in the Sufi tradition, the beloved. There's always this yearning for the beloved, right? And we experience that yearning again through different vehicles, different physical vehicles. But then if you actually go deeper than that, you come into a space of beauty and love that's just kind of amorphous, that's just existing of its own accord. And then you no longer need the vehicle to get there. And if, my dear Socrates, Diotima went on, man's life is ever worth the living, it is when he has attained this vision of the very soul of beauty. And once you have seen it, you will never be seduced again by the charm of gold, of dress, of comely boys, Greek culture at the time, it's kind of bizarre, or lads just ripening to manhood. Yeah, Greek culture. You will care nothing for the beauties that used to take your breath away and kindle such a longing in you, and many others like you, Socrates, to be always at the side of the beloved, and feasting your eyes upon him, so that you would be content, if it were possible, to deny yourself the grosser necessities of meat and drink, so long as you are with him. But if it were given to man to gaze on beauty's very self, unsullied, unalloyed, and freed from the mortal taint that haunts the frailer loveliness of flesh and blood, if, I say, it were given to man to see the heavenly beauty face to face, would you call his, she asked me, an unenviable life, whose eyes had been opened to the vision, and who had gazed upon it in true contemplation until it had become his own forever? And remember, she said, that it is only when he discerns beauty itself through what makes it visible that a man will be quickened with the truth, and not the seeming virtue, for it is virtue's self that quickens him, not virtue's semblance. And when he has brought forth and reared this perfect virtue, he shall be called the friend of God. And if ever it is given to man to put on immortality, it shall be given to him. So there it is. That's Keats, it's Socrates, it's Diotima, it's Plato, it's Hakuin, the Zen master, it's Shido Bunan, another Zen master, it's Alejandro Jodorowsky, it's Ernest Becker. It's all of these figures who are just pointing to the same thing via their art, via their philosophy, via their very being itself, saying it's right there. It's right there. Don't stop. Keep going because it's right there.